at his resort, but before leaving, reporters were suddenly hustled into the Oval Office to see the president sign a massive tax cut into law. It is now the law of the land, Mr. Trump's first and only major legislative achievement since taking office. CNN's Jeff Zeleny has this report.
Things are quiet here now at the White House with President Trump in Florida for the next 10 days or so. He'll be at his Mar-a-Lago retreat in Palm Beach, Florida. Now, he left the White House on Friday after signing that sweeping tax reform bill into law. $1.5 trillion, the biggest tax overhaul in some 3 decades. Now, of course, that will be a central fight in the midterm elections next year. But for now, the president, of course, was touting the accomplishments. He did not do so, though, with a year-end news conference, as most presidents have done in recent years. The president still worried, of course, about those nagging questions of the Russia investigation still hanging over his administration. But for the next 10 days or so in Florida, his aides say he'll have some relaxing time, likely some time on the golf course as well. Will also be working on his State of the Union address, which he will deliver in January. Now, all of this is coming as Vice President Mike Pence returned from Afghanistan on Friday. He had a secret trip there, an unannounced trip there. He is visiting troops. Of course, he becomes the first of either President Trump or the Vice President to visit a war zone. Now, Afghanistan, of course, America's longest war. The Vice President went there in the wake of the surge. President Trump, of course, sending more soldiers there. He is yet to visit. His aides say that is likely to happen sometime next year. All this is happening as the president, again, taking some rest and relaxation time. 2018, those midterm elections just around the corner. That tax bill the president signed into law will be one of the soundtracks of the midterm election campaign. Jeff Zeleny, CNN, the White House.
Jeff, thanks. Now, as we mentioned, the tax cut is the only significant piece of legislation to pass Congress, even though it's controlled by the president's own party. Jeff Zeleny asked President Trump if things would have gone better had he focused on a bipartisan issue earlier in his presidency. Listen.
You would have started with infrastructure at the beginning of this year. Would that have sort of
well, we're going to get infrastructure. Infrastructure is the easiest of all. Infrastructure is by far the easiest. People want it, Republicans and Democrats. We're going to have tremendous Democrat support on infrastructure, as you know. I could have started with infrastructure. I actually wanted to save the easy one for the one down the road. So we'll be having that done pretty quickly. I don't think we're going to have to do much selling. I think the corporations that are giving billions and billions of dollars away to their workers, and many more are coming, I think that's really what's selling this, maybe better than anybody could, including myself. But I think come February, when they open their checks and they see, wow, what happened? I have a lot more money in here. I think that's really going to be something very special.
Now to North Korea. The United Nations approved the new round of sanctions on Friday, this after the nation carried out yet another missile test last month. The ICBM had an increased range and therefore is a bigger threat. Among other things, the new sanctions limit Pyongyang's access to energy and aim to rein in the North's development of weapons. The U.S. ambassador to the UN lamented the lack of peaceful solution so far and emphasized the international community would not back down. Listen.
Today, for the 10th time, this council stands united against a North Korean regime that rejects the pursuit of peace. The Kim regime continues to defy the resolutions of this council, the norms of civilized behavior, and the patience of the international community. Their arrogance and hostility to anything productive has set their country on a destructive path. 9 times before today, we have asked the North Korean regime to choose the path of peace. And if they do, we would welcome them back into the community of nations. But Pyongyang has chosen the path of isolation. As we have in the past, we will continue to match the Kim regime's choice of aggressive actions with actions of international sanction.
The U.S. president applauded the new measures on Twitter, saying this, quote, "The world wants peace, not death." As for previous UN sanctions, they appear to have done little to slow the North's weapons program. In fact, North Korea has conducted 16 tests since February alone. Just this past June, a travel ban and a crackdown on North Korea's spying operations was followed about a month later by the country's first successful ICBM test. Then in August, the UN targeted the North Korean economy costing it about a third of its exports. Then, like clockwork, North Korea claimed to have tested a hydrogen bomb roughly 1 month later. During a day of rage protests along the Gaza border, Palestinian officials say Israeli forces killed 2 demonstrators. The Israeli military says about 2,000 Palestinians tossed rocks and burned objects toward Israeli soldiers on Friday. It's the latest violence after the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Palestinian leaders have condemned that decision. They say it's a violation of their rights. In the meantime, the Prime Minister of Israel is celebrating the U.S. commitment to move its embassy to Jerusalem. That despite UN condemnation. But Mr. Netanyahu says no UN resolution can change Jerusalem's history. Listen.
I think what it does is finally recognize a historical truth. Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel for 3,000 years from the time of King David. It's been the capital of the state of Israel for 70 years. And it's about time that the United States said, and I'm glad it said it, this is the capital, we recognize it. And I think that's going to be followed by other countries. We're now talking to several countries who are seriously considering now saying exactly the same thing as the United States and moving their embassies to Jerusalem.
That exclusive interview with Prime Minister Netanyahu from our Oren Lieberman. We'll have more of that later. In the meantime, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas says the decision means the U.S. no longer has a credible place in peace negotiations. Listen.
The United States is no longer an honest broker in the peace process, and we will not accept any plan from them because of its bias and violation of international law.
Let's talk more about this with our guest, Stephen Erlanger. Stephen is the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, joining us live from Brussels via Skype this hour. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the show, Stephen.
Thanks, George.
Let's talk about this issue of Jerusalem. It's always been seen as a final status issue for previous administrations, with the hopes of pushing the peace process forward between Israel and the Palestinians. But now the president has made this decision. The question, has the U.S. essentially given away an important piece of negotiations? And what does the president stand to gain from this?
Well, it's a very complicated question. I was based in Israel myself for nearly 5 years, so know the intricacies. Jerusalem is a place both sides claim. It's not an ecumenical place. Everybody believes their God gave it to them. So dividing it's very difficult. Now, Trump did something symbolic. Symbols actually matter. It doesn't yet have much substance, but it has upset the Palestinians, it's upset European allies, it's upset a fair amount of the Arab world, because symbols matter. Now, it is true, as Mr. Netanyahu says, that Jerusalem has been the spiritual capital of Israel for many thousands of years, and certainly of the state, though unofficially. Now, will the embassy move? I don't know. We'll have to see. The point is, it has upset already moribund peace process. I mean, that's the big question. What is Jared Kushner and President Trump doing toward the peace process? And how does this symbolic move, which he promised in the campaign, sorta, it's not what he promised. He promised to move the embassy right away, which he's not doing. But how much is this actually going to damage these behind-the-scenes efforts to create a peace process? Or is this announcement an indication that those behind-the-scenes processes have failed? That's, to me, the biggest question. Now, Mahmoud Abbas says the U.S. is no longer a fair broker. Well, it hasn't really been a fair broker for many, many years. It has never really held Israel to its own promises to the United States itself in terms of getting rid of illegal settlements and outposts. But at the same time, the United States has been an advocate for a certain degree of Palestinian rights and for the two-state solution. So as ever, these are very complicated things, but certainly what Trump did, what he announced, was basically a symbolic recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, has certainly upset a lot of American allies, but Mr. Trump is very good at doing that. That's something he seems to enjoy doing.
All right, Stephen, I'd like to shift to a different topic. This unanimous decision in the UN, these sanctions on North Korea, with China and Russia signing on, is this considered a game changer?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, you know, the U.S. had a defeat on the symbolic Jerusalem vote, but it was 15-0 in the Security Council on North Korea. I think clearly the Russians and the Chinese do not want a war in North Korea. And there has been a lot of talk coming out of the White House, not the Pentagon, but the White House, about preventative war against North Korea. Now, to some degree, this may be a bargaining chip, maybe it isn't, but it has certainly helped get the Russians and the Chinese to vote for another, I think, third round of sanctions against North Korea, which are really quite harsh, will put quite a lot of pressure on North Korea. Now, Kim, as we know, is very good at saying it doesn't matter, at doing something symbolic himself, another missile test, another atomic test. There are worries he's going to do an atmospheric test of a small bomb, but we'll have to see. In the meantime, there's no question this will put pressure on North Korea. I was very intrigued that Secretary of State Tillerson had really a balloon out there when he said to the North Koreans, we're ready to talk, we can talk about anything, let's just talk. And then the White House rather quickly shot that down. But I think there is a growing understanding that, you know, if this is going to end well, it will have to end in some form of negotiations. And it's very unlikely Kim's going to give up his nuclear capability, because that's the only thing in his mind that protects him from the United States and protects him from China as well. The Americans argue that Kim's intentions are not defensive and are not deterrence, but are offensive and have to do with reuniting the Korean Peninsula by the North. Now, that's, that's debatable, but that is the White House view of his intentions. He says no, but the UN vote is, in a way, one more effort to say to North Korea, look, calm down, let's talk about this.
Stephen Erlanger, live for us in Brussels with context and perspective. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, George.
Still ahead here on Newsroom, U.S. officials say they stopped a terror attack in the U.S. state of California. What we know about the suspect as Newsroom continues. There's a new development to tell you about around the U.S. president's travel ban. On Friday, an appeals court ruled the last version of the order, which restricted the travel of nationals from 6 Muslim-majority countries, that it violates federal law. Still, that ban remains in effect for now. The judges issued an order saying the ban would remain enforced while challenges go through the legal system. The U.S. Supreme Court is expected to issue a final ruling on it. The U.S. Justice Department is taking aim at an Obama-era investigation of Hezbollah. On Friday, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, ordered a review of Project Cassandra. That's a campaign that targeted Hezbollah and its alleged drug smuggling. A recent Politico report indicated the Obama White House hindered the investigation. The report said officials didn't want to threaten the Iran nuclear deal. In Melbourne, Australia, a man accused of plowing his SUV into a crowd of pedestrians Thursday has been charged with 18 counts of attempted murder. The 32-year-old suspect is also facing 1 count of endangering life. Police say that he has a history of mental illness and of drug use. Police say the suspect deliberately drove into a busy street and injured 18 people. Several people remain in critical condition. Here in the United States, authorities say they stopped a terror plot in the state of California. Officials say that a former U.S. Marine planned an attack in San Francisco and expressed support for ISIS. He allegedly said that Christmas was the perfect day to carry out this attack. CNN's Jessica Schneider has more.
The FBI has thwarted a plot that targeted San Francisco around the holidays. Authorities say Everett Aaron Jameson was plotting to stage an attack on Pier 39 in San Francisco sometime over this Christmas holiday. And the FBI agents who were tracking him online saying he was modeling his planned attack on those over the past few years, including San Bernardino and most recently in New York City. In fact, Jameson voiced his support for that truck attack in New York City on October 31st. That was when 8 people were killed on a bike path. And then the complaint says Jamison recently became a tow truck driver in his hometown of Modesto, California, leading to concerns that he could attempt that exact same type of attack that we saw in New York City. Now, the criminal complaint also details the letter that authorities found inside his home under a search warrant this week. The letter said things like, "You all brought this upon yourselves, and you've allowed Donald J. Trump to give away Al-Quds to the Jews." That's a reference to Jerusalem. Also, he said, "We have penetrated and infiltrated your disgusting country." Now, top officials here in the U.S. have been warning as recently as last month about this danger of a possible uptick in ISIS-inspired attacks right here in the U.S., especially with the collapse of the Islamic State's caliphate. The FBI did a search of Jamison's home in Modesto, California. That's just 90 miles from San Francisco, and they found firearms, empty magazines, ammunition, and fireworks. Jamison is now in custody. Jessica Schneider, CNN, Washington.
Jessica, thank you. The Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando, Florida, from just a year ago. The widow of the shooter now says statements that she gave to investigators should not be used at her trial. Noor Salman is charged with providing material support to foreign terrorists and obstruction of justice. Investigators say statements that she made after the attack indicated she knew what her husband planned to do. But her attorneys told the court Friday those statements were obtained unlawfully. Salman's husband, Omar Mateen, killed 49 people in June of 2016. Still ahead here on CNN Newsroom, CNN's exclusive interview with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, how Israel sees its relationship with the world changing for the better. Plus, the death toll driver, they say, plowed his SUV into pedestrians Thursday. He faces 18 counts of not likely to sit well with Moscow. In fact, the Kremlin has grown increasingly concerned with relations with the United States under the Trump administration. CNN's Fred Pleitgen explains why.
After heaping praise on President Trump for days, tonight, speaking to his generals, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is ripping into America and Trump's new national security strategy, which the Kremlin says is anti-Russian.
Diplomatically speaking, if I can put it in 2 words, it is of an attacking nature. And if we use military terms, it's no doubt aggressive. We need to take that into account in our practical work.
Trump mentioned Russia as a challenge to U.S. national security when he rolled out his new strategy on Monday.
We also face rival powers, Russia and China, that seek to challenge American influence, values, and wealth.
The strategy document, which his national security team wrote, went further, saying Putin's government is using, quote, information tools in an attempt to undermine democracies. There are signs this growing rift could lead to confrontations between the U.S. and Russia, including in Syria. Sources tell CNN the U.S. believes Moscow is deliberately breaking an agreement aimed at helping U.S. and Russian jets operate safely there. Moscow's response, America should get out of Syria altogether.
We believe that there are no legitimate reasons for their presence there at the moment.
Only last week, Putin and Trump exchanged warm words in several phone calls, and Trump has repeatedly heaped praise on Putin in public.
I respect Putin.
But while the president voices his admiration, U.S. authorities are following a tougher line, sanctioning several Russians under the Magnitsky Act this week, including the son of Russia's state prosecutor Yuri Chaika and Chechen strongman and Putin ally Ramzan Kadyrov, who pretended to laugh the sanctions off in a bodybuilding video on his Instagram account. But experts say Moscow's new rhetoric may be a sign its patience with President Trump is running out.
Putin and his presidential administration thought that sanctions were going to get lifted, relations are going to be a lot warmer. But, we are hampered by Congress, and it's not easy to just warm relations. And given the investigations that are ongoing in terms of the interference into our elections,
so far, Russian officials have been very careful to criticize U.S. policies, but to go softer on President Trump in the hope that he would be able to restore U.S.-Russian relations. But now that hope seems to be fading, leading to harsher reactions from the Kremlin. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Moscow.
Fred, thanks. Still ahead, CNN's exclusive interview with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. How Israel sees its relationship with the world changing for the better. You're watching CNN Newsroom live from Atlanta, Georgia this hour. Simulcast both on CNN USA here in the States, CNN International worldwide. Stay with us. A new round of sanctions imposed by the United Nations. The Security Council unanimously voted to put more pressure on Pyongyang. This in response to North Korea's provocative missile test in November. The sanctions are aimed at preventing further weapon development and applying economic pressure by limiting energy access, limiting smuggling, and the use of North Korean workers overseas. The U.S. President Donald Trump struck an aspirational note on Twitter saying this: the world wants peace, not death. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, expressed her disappointment with the lack of peaceful resolution so far.
9 times before today, we have asked the North Korean regime to choose the path of peace. And if they do, we would welcome them back into the community of nations. But Pyongyang has chosen the path of isolation.
And the Russian envoy said de-escalation in this case and in Pyongyang's provocations was vitally important.
The launch from Korean territory without warning of ballistic missiles poses tremendous risks to maritime and air transit in the region and poses grave risks to the lives of ordinary citizens. Such activity must immediately be put to an end.
So tough new sanctions imposed by the United Nations. The impact largely depends on 2 countries. CNN's chief U.S. security correspondent Jim Sciutto explains why.
Crucially, that includes Russia and China, who have been resistant recently, in fact saying that the U.S. arguably making as much trouble perhaps as the North Koreans in this relationship. But Russia and China, they have actual business with North Korea. So these sanctions, and crucially again, if followed through on, if implemented, have the potential to have real economic impact on North Korea. And that's really the primary leverage that the world, the international community has on North Korea right now. Keep in mind, China has real business there. China supplies them with the fuel oil that they need, and these sanctions promise to cut those by 80%, again, if China follows through. It also calls on these countries to withdraw North Korean workers that they have working inside their countries, and that applies to both China and Russia. So again, economic impact on North Korea if these countries follow through as said. So potential, but again, if that unanimous vote is followed through with action, then it could have real impact.
Jim Sciutto reporting there. Now, as for previous UN sanctions, they appear to have done little to slow North Korea's weapons program. In fact, the North has conducted 16 tests since February alone. Just this past June, a travel ban and a crackdown on North Korea's spying operations was followed about a month later by the country's first successful ICBM test. Then in August, the UN targeted the North Korean economy, costing it about a third of its exports. Like clockwork, North Korea claimed to have tested a hydrogen bomb roughly 1 month later. The U.S. President Donald Trump has left Washington to spend time in Florida at his resort there, but before leaving, reporters were suddenly hustled into the Oval Office as the president signed a massive tax cut into law. CNN's Jeff Zeleny has that report for us.
So this is the bill right here, and we're very proud of it.
President Trump signing the tax bill into law today, his final Oval Office act of the year. Injecting a burst of reality show drama into the moment, the president hastily summoning reporters after White House aides said he would sign the bill privately. But from his seat at the Resolute desk, the president making a rare acknowledgement of a favorite pastime, watching television.
We're going to wait till January 7th or 8th and do a big formal ceremony, but every one of the networks was saying, will he keep his promise? Will he sign it for Christmas, before Christmas? And so I immediately called. I said, let's get it ready.
The president hoping to end 2017 on a high note, presiding over the first major overhaul of the U.S. tax system in 3 decades. He downplayed concerns of the law's unpopularity with many Americans, or that it could be a weight on Republicans in the midterm elections.
I think it's selling itself. It's becoming very popular. But I think you'll see something on February 1st when they open up the paycheck. That's when you're going to start to see it.
Even as he blasted Democrats for standing in unison against the bill, the president said he believes his rivals will come aboard next year to support a major infrastructure plan.
The Democrats very much regret it. They wanted to be a part of it, just doesn't work out. I really do believe we're going to have a lot of bipartisan work done. And maybe we start with infrastructure, because I really believe infrastructure can be bipartisan.
It's an open question whether bipartisanship is wishful thinking or a New Year's resolution. As he reflected on his first year in office, the president complained about not getting credit for his accomplishments.
Harry Truman had more legislative approvals than any other president, and a record long held. And we beat him on legislative approvals, for which I get no credit.
We asked the president if things would have gone smoother if he had started with infrastructure rather than trying to repeal Obamacare.
I could have started with infrastructure. I actually wanted to save the easy one for the one down the road. So we'll be having that done pretty quickly.
When asked whether he had any regrets from the start of his presidency, Mr. Trump shook his head no. Yet Politico reported a memo from the president's handpicked RNC chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel, suggests the GOP is in danger of losing its majority in Congress next year. As Republicans brace to defend seats in the House and Senate, the role of the president's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, remains a critical question. At a year-end news conference on Capitol Hill today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made clear he blames Bannon for losing a Republican seat in Alabama.
Well, let me just say this. The political genius on display, throwing away a seat in the reddest state in America, is hard to ignore.
At the White House, there was no traditional year-end news conference like most presidents have done.
All I want for Christmas is to take your questions.
With the holiday season upon us, I'm delighted to see Americans giving each other the best Christmas present possible, a strong economy.
In fact, President Trump has not held a formal solo news conference since February. He was initially planning one to tout his accomplishments, CNN has learned, but some advisors argued against it to avoid being besieged with questions about the Russia investigation.
Thank you, David.
That tension was clear in the Oval Office today, as aides tried again and again to escort reporters out, even as the president seemed eager to talk. A few hours later, Mr. Trump arriving in Sunsplash, Florida with a bounce in his step, greeting supporters as he started a 10-day Christmas break.
Merry Christmas.
Even though President Obama and other presidents have long celebrated Christmas, Mr. Trump has taken credit for shining a new spotlight on the holiday, with one of his super PACs launching this ad.
Thank you, President Trump, for letting us say Merry Christmas again.
That has long been one of the big applause lines at Trump campaign rallies when Mr. Trump was running for office and since he's become president. He promises to bring back Christmas again. Of course, it's always been proper to say Merry Christmas, but his supporters have seized on that. As for Mr. Trump, he will be at Mar-a-Lago for the next 10 days, celebrating the Christmas holiday with a break from Washington. Jeff Zeleny, CNN, the White House.
Jeff, thank you. For those who celebrate Christmas, it has always been normal to say Merry Christmas. So let's talk about all of this, from tax reform to North Korea. We have a great deal to discuss with Inderjeet Parmar. Inderjeet is a professor of international politics at City University, live in our London bureau. Christmas upon us soon, Inderjeet. Merry Christmas to you, if that is the case. Let's start with this situation of tax reform, this new tax law, a major accomplishment for the president, for sure. It was a campaign promise delivered his first year in office. Put this into context, though, for us. Given the many other controversies surrounding this president, does this reset the table?
I don't think so. I think it's a continuation of basically the breaking of numerous promises. He did promise tax reform, but he also said to the people during the election campaign that, especially blue-collar workers and middle-class workers, that he was going to increase taxes on the rich and he was going to decrease taxes for them. But actually, this is probably a major act of kind of class warfare, because in the end, he's effectively transferring massive amount of wealth and income towards the very richest in the society. And this process really began probably about 2010, 2012, and really ramped up. And I think he's just continuing that. So it's not a reset at all. It's a continuation of really a kind of what you could say is a sort of corporate takeover of American politics and government. And I think next year, His supporters are going to probably see messages coming to them suggesting that Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security is going to be cut because the deficit is going to increase quite a lot as a result of this tax cut.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that moving forward into 2018, looking ahead at the midterm elections. What are the overall optics here? Does this translate as a campaign promise delivered to working Americans, or does it translate as a big gift for the rich and for corporations?
I think this is what, if you look at a public opinion poll after opinion poll, what we see is it's a deeply unpopular tax law now, and that it's largely seen as something which is transferring wealth to the very wealthy already. And effectively what this does is it continues that legitimacy crisis, the feeling of most American in the electorate that the government has really very little to do with solving their problems, that they're very, kind of busy with various kinds of scandals and probes and investigations and things like that. But actually, when you look at what has been going on in terms of deregulation and now this tax law, that largely government is about other people, and that their problems, their desire for a better future, if you're a college student and the indebtedness that you will suffer, if you're a factory worker, the health and safety laws and wage laws and so on, all of those are going down. So I don't think this is going to do very much for the legitimacy either of President Trump or the GOP, in fact, probably not even the Democratic Party, because even their suggestions about the tax law were merely to sort of reduce corporate taxes to about 25%. As opposed to 21%, which is what happened. So they've kind of shown their commitment to Wall Street much more than they have to Main Street during this particular period.
Okay, Inderjeet, I'd like to shift to another topic that we covered here in the show with regards to the UN, these sanctions on North Korea. A unanimous decision in the UN. Is this a game changer with China and Russia signing on?
Well, China and Russia have signed off on the several previous UN Security Council sanctions votes as well. The problem is that North Korea is already a deeply impoverished country. Half of its population is being basically fed by foreign aid. They have very little left to sanction. As Thomas Bossert, who's an advisor to Homeland Security, said, effectively, apart from starving them to death, there is nothing more that anybody can do. Russia and China are supporting these sanctions, but they're also helping probably to ease the impact of these sanctions. And the other thing, of course, is that they're suggesting that there should be a freeze for freeze, that the United States should stop ramping up the sanctions and the military threats and the military exercises in return for a North Korean freezing of missile tests and so on. I can't see anything being resolved here with further sanctions, and it looks to me that the likelihood of a military confrontation, a kind of military attack, a preemptive strike, seems to be increasing on a kind of weekly or monthly basis. And that, I think, is very dangerous for the people of that region. And I wonder what China and Russia will think about that kind of ramping up of tensions.
Inderjeet Parmar, live for us in our London bureau. Thank you so much for your time and your perspective today.
Thank you.
Still ahead here on Newsroom, authorities in the United States say they stopped a terror plot in the city of San Francisco. What we know about the suspect's military ties.
Samsung PowerBot is an edge cleaning machine.
The president. Plus, Russia investigators talked to Trump's longtime assistant. Who is Rona Graff and what does she know? Plus, the president hunkers down at Mar-a-Lago, why the luxury estate always seems to be in the middle of controversy. Let's go off front. Good evening, I'm Pamela Brown in for Aaron Burnett. And out front tonight, not meeting the press. The president left Washington today without holding a traditional end-of-the-year press conference, something we were told Trump wanted to do. It's a surprising decision given the president could tout his biggest legislative accomplishment to date, that sweeping tax bill that is now the law of the land. But White House advisors overruled the president, we're told. Two White House officials telling CNN the fear was over questions about Russia, questions they clearly didn't want him to answer. But that didn't stop Trump from giving his own version of reality after he signed the tax bill into law. Here he is on Obamacare and the end of the individual mandate. Take a listen.
essentially, I think Obamacare is over because of that, and we're going to come up with something that's really going to be very good.
So Obamacare is not over. 8.8 million people signed up for 2018 coverage, according to the Trump administration's own figures. Trump went on to boast about his own accomplishments.
We have more legislative victories than any other president.
Well, the bottom line is Trump has only had two major victories in Congress, this tax bill and the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch. And here's what he said about money from overseas.
We're going to bring back probably $4 trillion from overseas. Nobody knows the exact number, but it's massive. It'll be over $3 trillion. It could be $5 trillion, but it's a tremendous amount of money that was caught overseas.
And there's no guarantee the overseas money will come back to the U.S. And if it does, Fortune 500 companies report only $2.6 trillion offshore, according to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Our Jeff Zeleny is out front with us tonight. So, Jeff, this is the first time in 15 years a president has not held a year-end news conference.
Good evening, Pamela. It certainly is a change from a tradition. Most presidents have year-end news conferences of some form or another. But for the last 15 years, they have had news conferences, President Obama, President Bush, and of course going back even much further. But the reality here is there was a sense among the president's advisors that they were worried that his accomplishments, mainly signing the tax bill into law, would be overshadowed perhaps by the Russia investigation or other questions that still hang over this White House. But the president seemed in a good mood. I was in the Oval Office with him when he was signing that bill. He seemed like he was more eager to answer questions. I can tell you, Pamela, aides were surrounding the Resolute desk there, urging reporters to leave the room. They were trying to get the president off to Florida. He did, of course, talk about the accomplishments, and he also talked about things to come in the new year.
And you managed to ask the president if he has any regrets from his first year, right?
We did ask if he has any regrets, and he shook his head no, perhaps not surprisingly. But there are some indications that he wants to try and change things up, potentially in the new year, talking about infrastructure first and foremost, saying Democrats should work with him. So I asked him if things would have been different this year if they would have started with infrastructure, working with Democrats rather than trying to repeal Obamacare. He said no, he wanted to save infrastructure for the second year because it's easier. But Pamela, now the question is, it's an open question if that's a wishful thinking or perhaps a New Year's resolution to work in a bipartisan way on infrastructure. So many Democrats now do not want to work with this White House. Republicans think some projects are too expensive, but that is one of the things to put on the top of the list for the new year.
All right, we'll have to see how that optimistic view pans out in the new year. Thanks so much, Jeff Zeleny. And out front tonight, Stephen Moore, former senior economic advisor for the Trump campaign. He was also an informal advisor to the White House on tax policy. Also with us, Keith Boykin, former Clinton White House aide, and Tim Naftali, CNN presidential historian and former director of the Nixon Presidential Library. Gentlemen, great to have you on.
It's nice to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Tim, I'm going to just start with you just for perspective here. What does it say to you that the president seems to be breaking with tradition by not holding a year-end press conference at this point?
Well, what's really interesting is that when Mr. Trump ran for president, he pushed the idea that he was a great salesman. And he was very good at selling his candidacy, but he has not been that effective at selling his presidency. Look at his approval ratings. Why he would lose or miss an opportunity to promote his program and to answer questions deftly, I don't know. There are ways to distract from Russia. If he got a question he didn't want to answer, there are ways to handle that. You would think by now he would have learned how. But this president has only had one news conference. It is the lowest number of news conferences for any first-year president in modern presidential history. He doesn't have the practice. It's a shame. He missed a grand opportunity today.
And does it signal to you that his aides perhaps were concerned he didn't have the discipline to stick to an answer on the Russia investigation? And that's...
Well, I don't know their motives. Yeah. I'm saying that this is yet another missed opportunity for this president. He had a lot to say, he could have said, and he has to learn how to answer questions. Not every question was going to be about Russia.
Okay, Stephen, I'm going to go to you because as Tim said, the president has bragged about being a salesman, yet he says the tax plan is becoming so popular that he won't need to sell it much. Let's take a listen.
Mr. President, can you talk a little bit about how much you'll travel to sell this tax
I don't think I'm going to have to travel too much to sell it. I think it's selling itself. It's becoming very popular. But I think you'll see something on February 1st when they open up the paycheck. That's when you're going to start to see it.
But polls show, Stephen, only 33% favor this plan. Do you think he's making a mistake thinking he doesn't have to sell it?
Well, look, Kamala, I mean, are these the same polls that showed that Hillary Clinton was going to win 40 states in November? I think we've all learned that polling isn't very accurate in terms of, how people really feel about things. But look, this was probably Donald Trump's best week in office. I think, it's interesting. You said, well, he only has 2 victories, the Supreme Court appointment of Gorsuch, and then, of course, this tax cut. That's like saying, well, gee, he only hit 2 grand slams in the bottom of the 9th inning.
Well, to be clear, he was saying he had more legislative victories than any past president. There were 2 legislative. He pointed out, so we were sticking with the facts there.
I know. I get it. I'm just saying, yeah, maybe he only had 2 legislative victories, but for conservatives, those are really, really big victories. And I got to tell you, there's a euphoria among conservatives the last couple of days over this tax bill. We were very nervous about whether it would happen. I'm not too concerned about the polls on the tax cut because I think that this victory kind of does speak for itself. And I do think when people see, number one, how it impacts the economy, and I'm predicting 4% growth next year, something that would be about double what we had under Obama. And when people actually see the money in their paychecks, I think there will be. Let me put it like this. I think Democrats, what are they going to run on? I'm going to get rid of that tax cut that Donald Trump gave you. I'm not sure that's a political winner.
Keith, you were shaking your head.
Where to begin? I mean, this tax bill is so unpopular. It's the least unpopular tax bill, I think, that we've seen in decades. It's less popular than Obamacare was at its lowest point. It's lower in popularity than even the 1993 Bill Clinton tax increase. How do you make a tax cut less popular than a tax increase? You do it by skewing the benefits primarily toward the wealthy, which this tax bill does. Now, the president missed an opportunity surely today because there are other things he could have been talking about that he did want to talk about, not just Russia. But the government has refused to do anything about the children's health insurance program with 9 million kids who were left uninsured potentially. They just left town and didn't deal with that issue. They haven't dealt with DACA. President Trump said he was going to build a wall. He was going to repeal and replace Obamacare. He was going to lock up Hillary Clinton. He was going to drain the swamp. All these promises that he said he was going to do. He didn't do any of those things. And we're left with the tax bill that basically just gives him a tax break and people like him.
On the Obamacare, though, he does say he repealed the individual mandate, which is essentially getting rid of it. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But just to hit on your point on the tax bill, sure, it's unpopular in the polls, but as Stephen pointed out, more Americans will see more money in their paychecks. Companies like Comcast, Boeing, Wells Fargo, AT&T have already pledged to give bonuses, wage hikes to their employees. So do you think that will change, that it will become more popular because more people are going to see money in their paychecks?
Well, what we're probably going to see is a one-time impact on this. I mean, what's happening right now is that there's some political stunts and publicity stunts by various companies that are engaging in helping Donald Trump to sell this plan because they benefit from the corporate tax reductions. But in addition to that, we're also seeing that historically wage increases don't follow tax cuts like this. We saw this in 1986 with the tax reform from 1986. Wages actually fell during that period, 4-year period after the tax cuts. So there's no guarantee we're going to see any increase this time.
And quickly to that point, there wasn't really a political lift after you saw the tax cut in 1986, Stephen.
I'm sorry, there wasn't what?
There wasn't the political lift. Republicans lost the midterm in 1986.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I was there in 86 and I was working for Ronald Reagan at the time. And, that's the last time we reformed the tax system. And it's amazing to me. I mean, you go back to 1986, and I remember the vote on the Senate floor to cut the highest income tax rate to 28% from 50%. That passed 97-3. It was supported by Ted Kennedy, Al Gore, Howard Metzenbaum, virtually all of the Democrats. And it's amazing how the Democratic Party has degenerated to the fact that today or this week, not one single Democrat, none, not one in the House or Senate, voted for a tax bill because they said, it's going to cut the highest tax rate to 37%. I mean, I have to say, the Democratic Party has become an anti-business party. Yes, Keith, you're right. Well, let me just make this point. Keith, you're right. This is a pro-business, pro-American business tax cut. It's going to help American corporations, American small businesses, and that. But a lot of people on CNN have been saying it's a Nancy Pelosi said it. This just helps corporations. Well, we want to help corporations. We want jobs coming back to the United States and put America first. And boy, the Europeans and the Asians are not happy at all about this tax cut.
But go ahead,
Well,
Tim
I just
Sally.
want, this is not about the Democratic Party. This is about America. I wasn't there in 1986, but I was live, certainly. You remember, Mr. Moore, or Professor Moore, that because the 1986 tax reform had so many problems with it, George Herbert Walker Bush, who succeeded Ronald Reagan, had to fix it. And it was called the 1990 Budget Act.
Why doesn't he show his birth certificate?
Ginny Mo, CNN.
God bless Trumpy Bear.
New York.